My name is Emily Dawson. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life I've been described with the same handful of words: dependable, quiet, low maintenance. I work in a role that doesn't draw attention. One of those positions where, if everything runs smoothly, people forget you were ever there. I've learned that when you move through the world calmly, without demanding space, people often mistake that for softness, or worse, for absence. I'm not telling this story because I think it's extraordinary. I'm telling it because it's ordinary in a way that rarely gets named. This is a story about family, about being assumed rather than seen, and about what happens when silence stops being confusion and becomes a decision. For a long time, I believed that loyalty meant endurance, that if I stayed steady, if I didn't complain, if I adapted faster than everyone else, things would eventually balance out. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was just present, available, easy to overlook. The event that frames this story is simple to describe and complicated to live with. My parents left me behind during a family move and told me to figure it out. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed doors, no final speech, just logistics, assumptions, and a quiet moment where I realized I was no longer included in decisions that shape my own life. This isn't a revenge story. It's not about exposing anyone or proving someone wrong. I'm not interested in painting my parents, or anyone else, as villains. What I want to explore is the space between intention and impact. The kind of abandonment that happens politely. The kind that sounds reasonable when explained out loud. Because abandonment doesn't always come with goodbye. Sometimes it arrives as an email forwarded too late, a conversation you weren't invited into, a plan that's already moving while you're still standing still, trying to understand when you were supposed to catch up. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how this unfolded. Not just what happened, but how it felt to slowly recognize the role I'd been assigned without my consent. I'll talk about the small moments that didn't seem important at the time, the internal shifts that never showed on my face, and the choices I made quietly, without confrontation. I promise honesty, not dramatization, reflection, not retaliation. This is about psychological reversal, yes, but not the kind that explodes, the kind that settles, the kind that changes who you are allowed to be in your own life. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without expectation. Have you ever looked back at a moment and realized you were left behind long before anyone admitted it, even to themselves? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was to my family before anything went wrong. I wasn't the difficult one. I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the one whose emotions filled a room or whose needs rearranged schedules. If my family had drawn a map of itself, I would have been the connective tissue, useful, necessary, but never highlighted. The one who made transitions easier, the one who adapted. Growing up, I learned quickly what earned approval. Independence was praised. Needing less was admired. I became good at not asking questions that slowed things down. When plans changed, I adjusted. When expectations shifted, I recalibrated. There was a quiet pride in that. I told myself I was mature, capable, strong. And to be fair, that wasn't untrue. But strength, I would later learn, can be misunderstood when it's too consistent. In family conversations, I was often the afterthought, though no one would have described it that way. Decisions were discussed around me, not with me. It wasn't malicious, it was subtle. A habit. When I did speak, people listened politely, then continued as if the real conversation was happening elsewhere. I noticed this early, but I didn't name it. Naming things gives them weight, and I didn't want to be heavy. If someone needed help organizing paperwork, I was called. If something needed to be handled calmly without emotion, I was trusted. I became the person who absorbed complexity so others didn't have to. Reliable, efficient, quiet, invisible but in a socially acceptable way. At family gatherings, I was the one cleaning up plates while others lingered in conversation. Not because I was asked, but because no one noticed if I didn't. When relatives asked what I was up to, the question felt ceremonial. The answer rarely altered their assumptions about me. Emily's fine. Emily always figures it out. That sentence followed me for years. It sounded like confidence. It felt like dismissal. When I moved into adulthood, that role didn't dissolve. It solidified. My parents still saw me as the adaptable one, the low-risk variable. If something unexpected happened, I would manage. If plans were unclear, I would fill in the gaps, not because I was consulted, but because I was predictable. And I participated in this dynamic more than I want to admit. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't say I need more clarity or I'd like to be included earlier. I told myself it wasn't necessary, that love didn't need constant negotiation, that being easy to live with was a virtue. I see now how that logic protected everyone except me. There were moments, small ones, when I felt the imbalance. A conversation that paused when I entered the room. A plan referenced that I hadn't heard before. A decision was explained to me after it had already been finalized. Each time I explained it away. They didn't mean it like that. They assumed I'd be okay. They know I can handle myself. Those explanations became automatic, comforting even. They allowed me to remain calm without asking anyone else to change. But calm is not the same as consent. What's difficult to explain is that I didn't feel unloved. That's the part people struggle with when I tell this story. There were no cruel words, no overt rejection, just a gradual narrowing of space where my voice mattered. I was valued for my function, not my presence. And that distinction matters more than we're taught. By the time the family move was first mentioned, casually, almost as a footnote, I was already positioned as someone whose life was flexible enough to adjust around it. Not because I'd agreed, because I always had. At that point, I still believed my role was neutral, necessary, even honorable. I didn't yet understand that being the easy one had slowly turned me into the optional one. And I definitely didn't realize how close I was to finding out what happens when people assume you'll adapt one last time. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel dramatic at all. That's what made it dangerous. It happened during an ordinary phone call with my mother. We were talking about neutral things, work, the weather, how quickly the year seemed to be moving. Toward the end of the call, almost as an aside, she mentioned that they'd been looking at houses. Not thinking about looking, not maybe someday. Looking. I remember the way my attention sharpened, even though my voice stayed even. I asked where. "Oh, a few places," she said lightly. "Nothing final. Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it. That phrase landed softly, but it stayed. At the time, I assumed I'd hear more soon. A follow-up call. A proper conversation. Families discuss moves, especially ones that affect everyone. Days passed, then weeks. The next mention came in a group conversation. The kind where everyone is talking, but no one is really listening. A relative asked my father how things were going, and he replied, "Busy, getting ready for the move." The move. Definite now, concrete, already underway. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not panic, not anger, more like disorientation. As if I'd missed a step on a staircase I'd walked 100 times. I waited for someone to look at me, to loop me in, to say, "We haven't talked to Emily yet." No one did. Later that night, I sent a message asking for details. Not accusatory, just factual. Where? When? What does this mean? The response came hours later, brief, practical. They decided it was a good opportunity, better cost of living, a fresh start. The timeline was still flexible, but they'd already put down a deposit. I reread that message several times. A deposit meant commitment. It meant decisions had crossed the invisible line from hypothetical to real, without me. When I asked how they'd pictured my situation fitting into this, there was a pause, a long one. Then, "We figured you'd sort something out, you always do." There it was again. Said kindly, almost fondly. I told myself this was just a communication gap, a misunderstanding. Families misstep, they forget to loop people in, especially when things move quickly. Still, something about it stayed with me. Not the move itself, but the assumption. I wasn't consulted because I was seen as adaptable, which meant my preferences weren't obstacles. My needs weren't constraints. I was a variable that could be solved later. That night, I opened my notebook, the one I'd carried for years, and wrote down the date, just the facts. Who said what, how it was phrased. I didn't know why I did that. It wasn't for evidence. It was grounding, a way to anchor reality when my instincts were being smoothed over by rational explanations. Over the following weeks, information arrived in fragments. A mention of packing, a comment about school districts. Irrelevant to me, but telling. Conversations I wasn't part of, summarized afterward as if that counted as inclusion. Each update came after decisions had already been made. I adjusted my expectations instead of challenging the process. I asked fewer questions. I listened carefully. I didn't want to seem difficult or emotional or ungrateful. And no one noticed the quiet recalibration happening inside me. The first small cut isn't painful because of what it takes away. It's painful because of what it teaches you. It teaches you how people rank your presence, how replaceable is your input is, how easily your life can be planned around instead of planned with. At the time, I still believed this was temporary. That clarity would come, that someone would eventually say, "We should really talk about how this affects you." I didn't realize that this, the polite exclusion, the delayed explanations, was the conversation. And that by accepting it quietly, I was teaching them something too. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an accident. It becomes a pattern. At first, I still treated each new omission as separate. A missed detail here, a late update there. I told myself not to overinterpret. Families are messy, transitions are chaotic. Everyone was stressed. It wasn't personal. But repetition has a way of eroding excuses. The updates about the move began to arrive the same way every time. After the fact. A lease was signed. A moving date has been set. Utilities transferred. Each piece of information was delivered calmly, efficiently, as if I were being briefed on a project I wasn't assigned to, but was somehow still responsible for understanding. I noticed how language shifted. Not, "What do you think?" but "We've decided." Not, "Can we talk about this?" but "This is what's happening." And always, at the end, the soft reassurance, "You'll be fine. You're capable. You'll figure it out." Those phrases became the emotional equivalent of a pat on the head, not unkind, just final. What made it harder to push back was how reasonable everything sounded. There was no hostility to react to, no obvious injustice, just efficiency that didn't include me. When I tried to ask more direct questions about timing, logistics, whether there was any expectation of me relocating to, the answers were vague, non-committal, framed as flexibility. We didn't want to pressure you. We assumed you'd want to decide for yourself. On the surface, it sounded respectful, but respect without information is just abandonment with better manners. I began to feel something I hadn't felt before, a quiet self-doubt. Not about my competence, but about my right to clarity. Was I overreacting? Was this just adulthood, everyone managing their own lives separately? I compared myself to others in the family. Siblings were consulted. Their opinions were weighed. Their constraints are discussed openly. I told myself the difference was situational, that I lived independently, that I didn't need the same level of involvement. That explanation held until it didn't. Because independence doesn't cancel belonging. What changed during this phase wasn't their behavior. It was mine. I started adjusting internally before conversations even happened, lowering expectations, preemptively deciding not to bring things up. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to be the only one who did. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being the only person insisting a door should be open when everyone else is already walking through walls. So I stayed quiet. Not silently resentful, just observant. I listened to how often my life was referenced as flexible, how easily my stability was used to justify decisions that destabilized me. And I noticed something else. The more I absorbed without comment, the more normalized it became. No one checked in anymore. They assumed silence meant agreement, or at least acceptance. I thought about speaking up many times. I rehearsed calm sentences in my head, thought about how to phrase things without sounding accusatory. But every time I stopped myself with the same reasoning. This isn't the right moment. They're under pressure. I don't want to make this harder. Each time I chose restraint, it reinforced the narrative that I was fine. What I didn't realize then was that restraint, when unacknowledged, doesn't look like grace. It looks like permission. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when my father mentioned the final moving date in passing, weeks after it had been locked in. I nodded, asked a neutral question. The conversation moved on. Afterward, I sat alone and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I understood then that my role wasn't going to change unless I changed it. That waiting to be considered was no longer an option. That my silence was no longer misunderstood. It was being relied upon. That realization didn't make me reactive. It made me still. Because once you see how disrespect is normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition, you also see how power quietly shifts. And you begin to understand that staying quiet can be a choice, not a weakness, a strategy. But I wasn't there yet. At that stage, I was still rationalizing, still hoping things would self-correct, still believing that being patient would eventually be rewarded with inclusion. I hadn't yet accepted that the system was working exactly as designed, and that I had been helping maintain it. It's unsettling to realize you've been cast in a role without ever auditioning for it. By the time the move became irreversible, I could see the shape of the part I'd been playing for years. Not just in this situation, but in my family's emotional economy as a whole. I was the reliable one, the flexible one, the one whose life could be adjusted around everyone else's. No one ever said this out loud. That's the thing about roles like this. They're maintained through implication, not instruction. They're reinforced by tone, by timing, by who gets asked first and who gets informed last. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Conversations followed a predictable pattern. If a decision involved risk, inconvenience, or emotional complexity, it was discussed among those perceived as more sensitive. If it involved logistics, cleanup, or adaptation, it drifted toward me. I wasn't excluded because I was unimportant. I was excluded because I was efficient. Efficiency, I learned, makes people comfortable skipping your consent. When I reflected on my childhood, the pattern held. I was praised for not needing much, for handling things on my own, for being so easy compared to others. At the time, that felt like approval. As an adult, I saw it differently. It was training. Training to disappear when necessary. Training to self-regulate without support. Training to equate love with usefulness. What made this role so difficult to challenge was how positively it was framed. There was no villain to confront, no obvious injustice, just a steady current of assumptions flowing in one direction. You're fine. You'll manage. You don't need as much. Eventually, those statements stop sounding like compliments and start sounding like ceilings. During this phase, I began to notice how little curiosity there was about my internal world. My work, my plans, my limits. These details weren't explored, they were presumed. If I didn't volunteer information, it didn't get asked for. And I rarely volunteered because I'd learned that my details didn't shift outcomes anyway. So I conserved energy. I stopped trying to be seen and focused instead on seeing clearly. There was no dramatic awakening, no emotional outburst, just a gradual detachment from the story I'd been telling myself, that if I stayed steady long enough, I'd eventually be met with the same care I offered. What replaced that story wasn't bitterness. It was accurate. I realized that my family didn't see me as someone who needed consideration in moments of change. They saw me as someone who absorbed change. And absorption by its nature is invisible. Once I understood that, something loosened inside me. Not painfully, quietly. Like releasing a grip you didn't realize you'd been holding. I stopped waiting for inclusion. I stopped expecting explanations. And most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly I could accommodate other people's lives. This didn't make me cold, it made me precise. I began to treat interactions the way they were being offered to me. Transactional, not emotional. Clear, not hopeful. If I wasn't being asked for input, I stopped offering it. If plans were shared late, I noted the timing instead of reacting to it. And I wrote everything down. Not out of spite, but out of respect for reality. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you have two options: perform it better or step out of it entirely. At that point, I hadn't decided which path I would take. But I knew one thing for certain: I would never again confuse being useful with being valued. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come from a confrontation or a raised voice. It happened on a quiet afternoon, alone, with a calendar open in front of me. I was trying to make sense of overlapping timelines, my lease renewal, work commitments, and the moving date my parents had finally confirmed. I wasn't looking for meaning. I was looking for logistics. That's when I realized something simple and irreversible. There was no plan that included me. Not vaguely, not potentially, not even as a footnote. Their move had been designed as if my life existed on a parallel track, close enough to acknowledge, distant enough to ignore. Any connection between the two was assumed to be my responsibility to resolve. And suddenly, all the rationalizations fell apart. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't poor communication. This was a complete absence of consideration. I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at dates that didn't align, realizing no one had noticed or cared that they didn't have to. I felt something then that surprised me. Relief. Not because I was happy about being left out, but because the ambiguity was gone. The question of whether I was overreacting evaporated. The pattern was undeniable now, and patterns are easier to work with than hope. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't draft a message demanding clarity. I closed the calendar, and I decided quietly that I would stop organizing my life around people who weren't organizing theirs around me at all. That was the moment my silence changed character. Before it had been accommodating, now it was intentional. I thought back over the months, the delayed updates, the assumptions, the way my adaptability had been used as justification. I saw how my emotional restraint had been interpreted not as strength, but as availability. That afternoon, I took out my notebook again. I didn't write feelings, I wrote facts. What had been communicated? What hadn't? What was expected of me, implicitly, not explicitly? I listed what I had control over: my housing, my finances, my work, my time. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself how to stay aligned with their plans. I asked how to realign with my own. This wasn't a rebellion, it was recalibration. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. There was no reason to. The people who benefited from my flexibility weren't owed a transition period. What changed wasn't my behavior on the surface. I still answered calls, still spoke calmly, still listened. But internally, something had settled into place. I no longer volunteered explanations. I no longer fill silences. I no longer soften my needs to make them easier to ignore. When updates came, I acknowledged them without reaction. When assumptions were made, I let them stand, unconfirmed. I could tell this unsettled them, though no one named it. They were used to my cooperation, used to my reassurance. But I wasn't being uncooperative. I was being accurate. That day didn't make me stronger. It made it clearer. And clarity has a way of quietly rearranging power. I hadn't decided what I would do yet. There were still many options available, and I wasn't rushing toward any of them. But I knew this: whatever came next would be chosen, not absorbed. And for the first time in this entire process, that choice belonged fully to me. Once silence becomes intentional, it changes texture. Before, my quiet had been porous. It leaked explanations, reassurance, and emotional labor. I filled in the gaps automatically, smoothed edges, anticipated needs that were never clearly stated. Now my silence had boundaries. I still spoke when asked. I still responded politely. But I stopped translating myself into something more digestible. I let pauses exist. I let assumptions go uncorrected unless they directly affected me. This wasn't passive aggression. It was restrained with direction. At first, no one noticed. Or maybe they noticed, but misread it. They assumed I was busy, distracted, preoccupied with my own life. In a way, they were right. I was finally attending to it. As the move drew closer, the request began. Not dramatic, just practical. Could I help review documents? Could I store a few things temporarily? Could I be flexible with timing? Each request came with the same unspoken expectation: that I would accommodate without question. This time I didn't rush to respond. I considered each ask carefully, not emotionally, logistically. Did this serve me? Did it cost me something I wasn't willing to give? Was it reciprocal in any meaningful way? Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no. Often I said, "I'll get back to you." That phrase alone changed the dynamic. People who are used to your immediacy experience deliberation as resistance. I could hear it in the pauses, the subtle recalibrations in tone. They weren't angry, they were confused. I had stopped performing predictably. What struck me most was how quickly my silence was reinterpreted. It wasn't seen as self-respect. It was seen as uncertain, weakness, withdrawal. They assumed I was overwhelmed. I let them. There's a particular kind of power in allowing people to underestimate your clarity. It buys you time. It lowers their guard. It keeps their behavior honest. During this phase, I gathered information quietly. Not secrets, patterns. Who reached out? Who didn't? Who clarified expectations? Who continued to assume? I noticed that no one asked how I was planning to handle the move's impact on my life. Not once. The focus remained on logistics that benefited them. That absence of curiosity told me everything I needed to know. My silence wasn't creating distance, it was revealing it. Emotionally, I felt steadier than I had in months. There was no more internal argument about whether I was being fair. I was responding proportionally to what was offered, and what was offered was minimal. I didn't confront anyone because there was nothing to debate. The facts were clear. My role had been defined without me. Now I was redefining it quietly, without asking permission. When the final moving date arrived, they informed me, not asked, not discussed. I thanked them for letting me know. That response surprised them more than any protest would have, because silence, when chosen, doesn't invite negotiation. It signals finality. At this point, I wasn't planning a dramatic exit. I wasn't scheming. I was simply no longer compensating for other people's omissions. And the more I withdrew that compensation, the more exposed the structure became. They began to feel the absence of something they'd never consciously acknowledged relying on. But they still didn't know what I was doing. And that was exactly the point. While everything on the surface stayed calm, something else was happening quietly, methodically, out of view. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness with intent. I began by paying closer attention, not to what people said, but to what they consistently did. I tracked timelines, noted who initiated contact and when, observed how information flowed and where it stopped. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing. I was mapping reality. Patterns don't lie when emotions are removed. I reviewed my finances with a level of precision I hadn't needed before. Not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted independence that didn't rely on goodwill. I reassessed my housing situation, my job flexibility, and my legal obligations. I asked myself hard questions and answered them honestly. What would happen if I needed nothing from them? What would change if I stopped being available by default? What leverage already existed that I'd never needed to name? Most of the leverage, I realized, came from proximity and assumption. I had been the emotional buffer, the local presence, the one who handled overflow. Quietly, I began disentangling myself from those functions. I stopped storing things that weren't mine. I redirected administrative tasks back to their owners. I created clean boundaries around my time, without announcements. Each change was small enough to seem incidental. Together, they shifted the balance. I also documented everything, not in a dramatic dossier, just clear the records, dates, messages, commitments made and not followed up on. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for clarity, my own. What they never noticed was how much stability I had been providing simply by being reachable. How many loose ends I tied without acknowledgement. How often did I make their lives smoother by absorbing friction? When that absorption stopped, the friction didn't disappear. It surfaced. Suddenly, there were minor inconveniences, missed details, small stresses that had previously bypassed them. They didn't connect these things to me, they just felt unsettled. I didn't rush in to fix it. I stayed kind, neutral, unavailable in very specific ways. Emotionally, this period was quieter than expected. There was no thrill in preparation, no sense of victory, just focus. The kind that comes from finally aligning your actions with what you know to be true. I wasn't hiding anything, I just wasn't sharing it. And that distinction mattered. People assume silence means nothing is happening. They mistake calm for stasis. They don't imagine that someone who isn't reacting is repositioning. That's the advantage of being underestimated. By the time anyone sensed a shift, it was already structural, not emotional, not reactive. They still believed I was adapting, that I would, as always, figure it out. They didn't realize I already had, and that the version of me they were planning around no longer existed. The moment of clarity didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sudden sense of triumph. It came quietly, during a routine review of my documents, when I saw the situation for what it truly was, not emotionally, but structurally. I realized I wasn't just uninvolved in their plans. I was no longer dependent on them in any meaningful way. That may sound obvious. I was an adult, financially stable, independent on paper, but emotional systems don't always update when circumstances do. For a long time, I had still been operating as if my role in the family required accessibility, responsiveness, and accommodation. It didn't. When I laid everything out, my finances, my housing options, my work flexibility, I saw that I had choices they weren't accounting for. Not because they were hiding them from me, but because they assumed I wouldn't exercise them. The real leverage wasn't money or proximity. It was an absence. I saw clearly how much of the family's logistical ease relied on my availability. How many systems assumed I would be nearby, responsive, and compliant. How often was my presence factored in without being acknowledged? Removing myself from that equation wouldn't cause drama. It would cause gaps. That realization didn't make me smile. It didn't feel vindicating. It felt clean. Like finally understanding the rules of a game I'd been playing without a manual. I also recognized something else. Nothing I did from this point forward needed to be explained. There was no moral obligation to justify boundaries that corrected an imbalance I hadn't created. No requirement to soften the impact of choices made without me in mind. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power, but that I no longer needed permission. I sat with that understanding for several days. I didn't rush to act. I let it settle. Because decisions made in emotional spikes tend to replicate the same dynamics you're trying to leave. What I wanted wasn't a reaction. It was alignment. During that time, communication continued as usual. Polite, sparse, functional. No one asked what my plans were. No one checked whether I needed support. Their silence confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't expected to leave. I was expected to adjust. That expectation became my final piece of information. When you see clearly what others assume you'll tolerate, you also see where their certainty ends. And that's where your freedom begins. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. I didn't hint at it. There was nothing to gain from premature disclosure. This wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about choosing a future. And that choice, once made, would be irreversible. There's a moment, once clarity settles in, when waiting becomes a decision of its own. I reached that moment quietly. Up until then, I had been observing, preparing, aligning. I hadn't crossed any lines, I hadn't closed any doors. Everything was still theoretically reversible. If someone reached out, if a conversation finally happened, if inclusion arrived belatedly. But I knew better than to confuse possibility with probability. The decision point wasn't about anger or self-protection. It was about integrity, about whether I would continue living in a structure that required my self-erasure to function. I listed my options carefully. I could confront them, lay everything out, explain how excluded I felt, ask for acknowledgement. That path promised emotional release, but no structural change. Even if they apologized, the underlying assumptions would remain. I could relocate to follow them, uproot my life to remain connected to people who hadn't considered me in the move itself. That option required the most sacrifice and offered the least dignity. Or I could do something quieter. I could accept their decision as final and make one of my own that didn't orbit it. That third option didn't involve ultimatums. It didn't require confrontation. It simply required me to stop positioning myself as adjacent to their lives, to step fully into my own. What made this choice difficult wasn't the fear of consequences. It was grief. Grief for the version of family I had believed I was part of. Grief for the hope that consideration would arrive organically if I waited long enough. But grief, unlike resentment, doesn't demand action. It just asks for honesty. And the honest truth was this: staying emotionally available to people who planned without me was costing me more than leaving ever could. So I decided I would not move with them. I would not restructure my life to remain convenient. I would not explain myself preemptively. Instead, I would finalize my own plans: housing, work, location, without reference to theirs. I would create a life that didn't assume proximity, compliance, or emotional labor as prerequisites for belonging. This wasn't withdrawal, it was completion. Once the decision was made, everything else felt lighter, not easier, but simpler. There was no longer an internal debate running in the background, no ongoing calculation of how to stay aligned. I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was cutting the pattern off. And I knew that when the consequences began to surface, they wouldn't feel dramatic. They would feel confused, sudden, unfair to them. But to me, they would feel inevitable, because this decision hadn't been made impulsively. It had been made over months of silence, assumption, and absence. And once you choose yourself quietly, there's no need to announce it. The change speaks for itself. After the decision, I didn't feel urgency. I felt order. I approached the next steps the same way I approached everything else during that period, methodically, without commentary. No declarations, no emotional framing, just action aligned with reality. I finalized a new lease, one that suited my work, my routines, my long-term stability. I adjusted my budget to prioritize independence over flexibility. I updated my emergency contacts, my mailing address, and my records. Quiet tasks, invisible tasks. I informed my workplace of my long-term plans, removing any ambiguity about relocation. I renegotiated responsibilities in ways that anchored me where I was, not because I needed permission, but because clarity prevents future pressure. No one in my family knew any of this was happening, not because I was hiding it, but because no one asked. Their move accelerated, boxes were packed, timelines tightened. They spoke in the future tense that didn't include me, and I responded in the present tense that didn't correct them. There's a strange calm that comes from no longer trying to be understood. I wasn't withholding information out of spite. I was simply no longer offering access to decisions that weren't collaborative to begin with. As moving day approached, practical gaps appeared, small ones at first. things that would have previously fallen into my orbit. A document is misplaced, a timeline misunderstood, a minor coordination issue. They handled these things themselves, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes inefficiently. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction but with confirmation. This was what happened when the silent infrastructure stepped away. Still, no one connected it to me. I was still perceived as passive, still assumed to be waiting, still imagined as adjacent. That misperception worked in my favor, because when people think you're standing still, they don't brace for impact. The final administrative steps came together smoothly. My life, for the first time, felt self-contained, not isolated, complete. I didn't announce my plans before their move. I didn't see the point. Announcements invite negotiation, and I wasn't available for it. Instead, I let time do what explanations couldn't. When the moving truck arrived and they left town, I received a brief message, a logistical update. No emotion, no question. I replied with a neutral acknowledgement. They believed everything was as it had always been. They were wrong, and the consequences of that assumption were already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. They arrived in confusion. A delayed response that used to be immediate. A problem that lingered longer than expected. A task that no one seemed to be handling anymore. At first, these were framed as minor inconveniences, adjustments, the normal friction of change. They assumed it was temporary, that once things settled, the familiar ease would return. It didn't. Without my proximity, without my quiet availability, the system they'd relied on began to strain. Not dramatically, subtly, the way you only notice something is missing when you reach for it automatically and come up empty. They started asking questions, but not the right ones. Do you know where this document might be? Can you remind me what the process was for that? Didn't you usually handle this part? I answered factually, briefly, without stepping back into the role. Sometimes the answer was no. Sometimes it was, I'm not involved in that anymore. Sometimes silence. Each response landed heavier than I expected. Not because it was harsh, but because it was final. They weren't angry yet. They were unsettled. The most telling part was how often they referenced the past. You used to. We always. Normally you. Those phrases revealed the assumption they hadn't known they were making, that my presence was permanent, my function guaranteed. I watched as they tried to recreate the ease they'd lost without acknowledging why it was gone. They reorganized responsibilities, reached out to others, tried to redistribute the weight. But systems don't adapt easily when they're built on invisible labor. The emotional shift came next. Calls became more frequent, but less specific. There was a searching quality to them, as if they were feeling around in the dark for a switch they couldn't quite locate. How are you? Everything okay? Okay. Questions that arrived late, after months of silence. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I didn't fill the space with reassurance. I didn't translate my calm into permission. I was okay. And that, strangely, seemed to disturb them more than if I hadn't been. Because my stability contradicted the story that they'd been telling themselves. That I was waiting, adjusting, absorbing. The realization crept in slowly. I hadn't followed. I hadn't adjusted. I hadn't been left scrambling. I had moved on, quietly, completely. They began to feel a loss they couldn't name, not of a person exactly, but of a function they'd never acknowledged depending on. And still, no one asked the central question. No one said, when did this change? No one said, what did we miss? Instead, the discomfort lingered, unresolved, growing heavier with each interaction. Because consequences don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply show up as absence, steady, immovable, and impossible to ignore. By the time panic appeared, the window for repair had already closed. It didn't arrive as an apology. It arrived as an urgency. Messages started coming closer together, no longer spaced by convenience, but by need. The tone shifted, less certain, more tentative. There was a carefulness now, as if they were testing the ground before putting weight on it. We should talk soon. Just wanted to check in. Things feel different. They did feel different because they were. What struck me most was how the concern surfaced only after the consequences became uncomfortable. Not when I was excluded. Not when decisions were made without me. But when the absence of my role began to cost them something. That timing mattered. When we finally spoke openly, not emotionally, just directly, I could hear the disorientation underneath their words. They didn't understand when the shift had happened. To them, it felt sudden, unfair, like I'd changed without warning. But change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it accumulates quietly, one overlooked moment at a time, until it solidifies into something unmovable. They ask questions now that would have mattered months earlier. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't we know you felt this way? I answered calmly. I told them I had been consistent, that my responses had matched the level of inclusion I was offered, that I hadn't hidden my needs. I'd simply stopped compensating for their absence. There was a pause after that, a long one. I could sense the scramble to reframe the situation, to find a version of events where this could still be fixed with the right words, the right reassurance. They offered explanations of stress, oversight, good intentions. I didn't argue with any of it. Because explanations don't reverse patterns, and intentions don't rebuild trust once it's been eroded by assumption. The hardest part, for them, was realizing there was nothing dramatic to push against. No anger to soothe, no emotional outburst to contain. Just finality. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't withdrawing affection to make a point. I was simply no longer available to a dynamic that required my silence to function. That realization landed slowly. They asked what they could do now. I told them the truth. Nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because care that arrives after consequence isn't repair. It's a reaction. And reactions don't change systems. This wasn't a door slammed shut. It was a door that had quietly closed while everyone was looking the other way. And by the time they noticed, it no longer had a handle on their side. When the confrontation finally happened, it was nothing like what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no emotional release. It took place in a neutral setting, during a scheduled conversation, with everyone speaking carefully, as if volume itself might fracture something fragile. What stood out immediately was how measured I felt. Not detached, not numb, just steady. They began by explaining themselves again, this time more slowly, more deliberately, as if the right sequencing of words might unlock a different outcome. They acknowledged mistakes, not explicitly, but indirectly. Poor communication, assumptions, moving too fast. I listened, truly listened, not because I was waiting to respond, but because I wanted to understand whether anything had fundamentally changed. It hadn't. Even in this moment, the focus was on resolution without disruption, on restoring comfort without restructuring responsibility. They wanted reassurance that we were okay, without confronting what okay had cost me. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I told them I didn't feel angry, that I wasn't holding on to resentment. I understood how the situation had unfolded. Then I said the part that mattered. I wasn't included when decisions were made that affected my life. So I made my own decisions. No embellishment, no emotional framing, just cause and effect. I explained that I had stopped interpreting silence as neutrality, that I no longer believed being adaptable meant being invisible, that I had built a life that didn't rely on being considered late or as an afterthought. They asked if I could have handled it differently. I said yes. I could have demanded attention. I could have insisted on conversations. I could have reacted loudly enough to be noticed. But that would have required me to fight for space I shouldn't have had to defend, I said. And I didn't want a role that only existed when I demanded it. That landed harder than anything else. There was a moment of stillness after that. Not discomfort, recognition. The kind that arrives when the story you've been telling yourself no longer fits the facts in front of you. They didn't argue. They didn't apologize in the way people expect apologies to sound. They simply sat with it. And so did I. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic resolution, no promise of change, no emotional closure. Just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted and that it couldn't be negotiated back into its previous shape. We parted politely, calmly, without heat, and that, more than anything, confirmed I had made the right choice. The person I am now wasn't created by confrontation. She was shaped by what happened after. There was a quiet adjustment period once everything settled. Not painful, just unfamiliar. When you step out of a role you've played for years, there's an empty space where reflex used to be. No one is calling for help. You haven't offered. No assumptions to manage. No emotional labor waiting to be performed. At first, that space felt strange. Then it felt honest. I began to notice how much energy I had been spending anticipating other people's needs. How much of my calm had been maintenance, not nature. Without that constant outward focus, my life became simpler. Not smaller, but more intentional. I'm still reliable, still thoughtful, still capable, but I'm no longer available by default. I choose when to show up. I choose what I carry. I choose which silences are peaceful and which ones are signals. My relationship with my family didn't disappear. It changed shape. Boundaries replaced assumptions. Distance replaced enmeshment. The connection that remains is quieter, more realistic. There's no bitterness in that. I don't need to be understood by everyone to be grounded in myself. What surprised me most was how this shift affected other areas of my life. Work dynamics changed, friendships clarified, people who relied on my overfunctioning adjusted or drifted away. And I let them, not out of punishment, but out of alignment. I no longer measure my value by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how honest my presence feels, whether my participation is chosen on both sides. The version of me who stayed quiet out of fear of being inconvenient is gone. In her place is someone who understands that inconvenience is often the cost of mutual respect. I don't regret how long it took me to get here. Awareness has its own timeline, and survival strategies don't dissolve until they're no longer needed. What I carry forward isn't hardness, it's discernment. I know now that quiet doesn't mean powerless, that absence can be louder than protest, that dignity doesn't require performance. And most importantly, I know this. Being left behind didn't diminish me. It clarified me. There's a tendency, when stories like this end, to look for a clean moral, a sentence that ties everything together neatly. Something satisfying, something reassuring. Real life rarely offers that. What it offers instead is perspective, earned slowly, often quietly, through moments that don't feel important until long after they pass. For a long time, I believed abandonment had a certain shape: loud, obvious, cruel. I believed it came with slammed doors or final arguments or dramatic exits. I was wrong. Abandonment doesn't always come with goodbye. Sometimes it comes with reassurance, with phrases that sound supportive but function as dismissive, with the assumption that someone will figure it out because they always have. The most painful part wasn't being left behind during the move. I realized how long I had been left behind emotionally, without anyone meaning to notice. And that's the part I want to be clear about. This story isn't about bad people. It's about unexamined roles, about how systems form quietly around the most accommodating person in the room, about how strength, when unacknowledged, gets mistaken for endless capacity. There was no moment where I won. There was no revenge, no exposure, no dramatic apology that fixed everything. What there was choice. I chose to stop translating my silence into consent. I chose to stop absorbing consequences that weren't mine. I chose to build a life that didn't require me to be overlooked in order to belong. That choice didn't make anyone else smaller. It made me whole. If you're listening to this and feeling a dull recognition, if parts of this story feel uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this gently. You are not difficult to want to be included. You are not selfish for needing clarity. You are not dramatic for noticing patterns. And you don't have to announce your boundaries for them to be real. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing the role that costs you the most and let the silence reveal what was always there. I didn't leave my family in anger. I left a version of myself that believed love had to be earned through endurance. And I've never been more at peace. So I'll end with one question, not to provoke, not to judge, but to open a conversation. Have you ever realized quietly that you were carrying more than your share? And what changed when you finally set it down? If you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.